Thank you very much, and welcome to this first bilingual webinar. It's a real pleasure to welcome our Spanish guests and Natalia, who runs the SMN en Español, and our interpreters, who are going to be hard pushed, or not hard, they'll be hard at work in the background, even as I speak, having to translate hard at work. So this evening, we've got Jack Hunter, who's not in his normal cool, wet Wales, but he's coming from New York State, where he's rather too hot. And
Very
I say
hot.
I'm not at all hot down here in France, not today at any rate. And he's going to be talking this evening about a very interesting topic, which seems to me also to have some crossovers with the work of Jeffrey Kripal and the way that he looks at the so-called impossible. And his title is Deep Weird, which happens also to be the title of his latest edited book, which I'll be reviewing in the next issue. High Strangeness, Boggle Threshold, and Damned Data in Academic Research on Extraordinary Experience. In other words, there is a lot of data if you're prepared to look through the telescope, but a lot of academics aren't prepared to look through the telescope. And let me just tell you something that you may or may not know, and that's the origin of the word Boggle threshold. And this was invented by René Tickel, or René Haynes, who was a senior member of the Society for Psychical Research and was the mother of Sir Crispin Tickel, who was an honorary member and a diplomat. And so the Boggle threshold is where, beyond which you just find it incredible, just you can't believe it. And I remember Larry Dossey talking at 1993 at Mystics and Scientists, and he said, well, you English, you have your Boggle threshold set just right. So I don't know where yours is set, but certainly it's quite likely that it'll go over it this evening. Maybe you should have a poll at the end to see how many people have been boggled by what Jack's got to share with us. And you'll have seen his biography, which is extensive. He teaches on quite a number of courses, including the Aleph Trust, and I'm a sort of co-tutor with him. And normally his latest actual book is Sacred Geography: Conversations with Place. So really interesting to have you on the platform, and over to you, Jack.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'll share my screen and then we can make a start. Go. Can everyone see that okay? Yep, and everyone can hear me okay? Excellent. Okay, so I'll just tell you a little bit about myself briefly. I am an anthropologist by training, so my PhD was in social anthropology at the University of Bristol. My undergraduate degree was in archaeology and anthropology, so quite immersed in the anthropological world. And my PhD took the form of an ethnographic study of contemporary trance and physical mediumship at a private home circle in Bristol. I spent about 7 years researching this group, attending seances with them, participating in mediumship development myself, which gave me some interesting experiences and really opened up this idea of there being an experiential dimension to these kinds of practices, that if you want to understand them, you have to understand the experiences. So I decided that what I needed to do was to try to develop what I call a non-reductive anthropology of the paranormal. So we're not trying to explain these things away in terms of like social and psychological functions or in terms of symbols or whatever it is. I'm not saying that those things don't exist. They're all part of it, but there's also this experiential aspect of it that needs to be taken into consideration. I trained to be an RE teacher, so teaching religious education in schools, and I also have a bit of a background in permaculture, and this has led me into thinking about how these paranormal things that I'm interested in might be embedded within sort of wider ecological systems. So a lot of my work recently has been focusing on the ecological aspects of extraordinary experiences. I'm an honorary research fellow with the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre, which is based in the University of Wales, Trinity St David. And I've also got affiliations with the Parapsychology Foundation and the Parapsychological Association. And I teach on the MAs in Ecology and Spirituality. And another MA that I teach on is Cultural Astronomy and Astrology with the University of Wales in the Sophia Centre, and with David with the Aleph Trust on consciousness, approaches to consciousness. So I've got quite a broad interest that kind of takes in consciousness studies, archaeology, anthropology, folklore, and all sorts of things, really. These are just a few snaps to give you a sense of the Bristol Spirit Lodge where I did my field work. It was a sort of yeah, it's a plain kind of house on a normal street in Bristol, but once you go through the door, out through into the garden, they had a specially constructed shed, which was their seance room. And I did interviews with mediums. I interviewed spirits as a part of my non-reductive approach. And I also engaged in the practices myself to get that experiential insight. And I had a few anomalous experiences along the way. I'll just mention one now while we're warming up for the deep weird. This was a profound experience for me. It was actually in one of the very first seances that I attended. I saw the medium sitting in the cabinet. You can see this chair in a curtained off corner of the room. And I could see this green mask kind of appear over her face. It looked like a kind of a stereotypical kind of Shaolin monk kind of face. So like bald head, Chinese. And it was luminous and it slid down to her chest and just sort of dissolved and evaporated. And I felt at the time that it was a hallucination, and I have had hallucinations, so I know what a hallucination feels like, and I kept it to myself. And because it was one of these early seances, I didn't want to make it seem like I was someone who has, weird experiences all the time, because generally I don't. But then when we went out into the house afterwards to sort of decompress and talk about, you usually have tea and biscuits and talk about things that they might have seen in the seance. And someone else independently said, did anyone see that green face? And I had no choice but to say that I had seen it. And I told them that I thought that it was a subjective hallucination, but obviously it was one that other people saw as well. So this made me realize that, the standard approaches in anthropology were not really adequate for understanding these kinds of things. How do social functions and psychological functions help us to understand how it's possible to have, a shared hallucination, for example. So that's just a little taste of some of the things that I experienced. And what I'm going to talk about now is really how my thinking about these things has developed, and how, yes, trying to sort of build a kind of a theoretical framework really for engaging with these kinds of experiences in a non-reductive way. Okay. And I have a few publications if anyone is interested. Okay, so this is really based around ideas that I explored in two books. One, Damned Facts. They're both edited books, so it's not just me in there. There are other contributors. One is Damned Facts, which is really exploring what a Fortean approach to religious studies might look like. And the more recent book, Deep Weird, is about the varieties of high strangeness experience. So I'm going to touch on some of these issues as we go through the talk. And this is how I'm going to structure it. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of the weird, take it back to a deep kind of Anglo-Saxon understanding. Then I'll talk a little bit about academic research on the varieties of extraordinary experiences. I'll talk about Boggle thresholds, which we've already touched on briefly. And then these kinds of the things that follow after that Boggle threshold section are trying to step beyond those thresholds and really engage with the high strangeness. So I'll talk about Fortean studies, which I think are, an interesting kind of parallel to the academic approach. And we get out of that this concept of high strangeness. And then I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the phenomenology of these experiences and different ways that we might, that not just us, but the other people who have these experiences kind of frame them, so how they describe them, they might describe them as weird or uncanny or surreal. And I'll give a couple of examples from my own collection of experiences. And then the very last part of the talk will be kind of a broader theoretical sort of framework, which I call ontological flooding, which is the kind of approach that I developed out of my PhD research. But it's not, I wouldn't say that it's a unique approach or even particularly innovative, but it's useful and it resonates with other approaches. So, and then I'll conclude. Okay, so here we go. So yeah, the reason why I want to think about the weird is because, when people have these experiences, they very often do describe them in those terms. And we don't really think about the kind of the meanings of the words that we use very often. But the meaning of the word weird, it has a long history. And if we dig into the kind of archaic understanding of the weird, I think it tells us something about these experiences that people have today that they label as weird. So this is from the work of Brian Bates, who was a psychologist, I think at the University of Sussex. And yeah, he wrote a book basically kind of trying to reconstruct an Anglo-Saxon magical worldview. And central to this Anglo-Saxon worldview was the concept of the weird. And he says, in its archaic original sense, weird meant that aspect of life which is so deep, so all-pervasive, and so central to our understanding of ourselves and our world that it was inexpressible. Weird refers to our personal destiny. It connects us to all things, thoughts, emotions, events in the cosmos, as if through the threads of an enormous, invisible but dynamic web. So, when people use this word weird today, although we don't necessarily use it in the Anglo-Saxon sense, these are the deeper kind of connotations of what they're saying. It's also interesting because it shows that, the weird has always been deep. The concept of the weird is it's almost about very deep structures or deep processes of reality. Okay, so when we use the word weird today, it's kind of simplified to refer to things like uncanny experiences, or maybe to be an equivalent of strange or bizarre, and sometimes even absurd. But this deeper idea, I think it gives us a more interesting kind of philosophical understanding of what the weird entails. And then just to kind of bring the deep weird into context, what I mean by deep weird is that these experiences might, we don't want to brush them aside. They might actually have something very valuable to tell us about the nature of reality, about the nature of ourselves. And I think it also has deep implications for our understanding about the non-human world and the way that we engage with that. So when I talk about deep weird, I'm talking about these experiences that really are profound for people, but that also tell us something important and useful. Another kind of way that I think about the deep weird is, we could have a very surface approach to the weird as well. Like you could think of like paranormal reality kind of TV as one very surface approach to the weird. Or we can have a deep approach to the weird where we think about it philosophically and analytically. So that's what I mean by deep weird. Okay, so, the history of extraordinary experience research is very long, actually. We might think of it maybe, well, probably not you guys, but in popular consciousness as quite a fringe activity. But actually, it's a concern that has gone right back into, intellectual history. We could probably go back much further than people like William James, but, the Society for Psychical Research in 1882, the first organization to adopt a scientific approach to investigating what we would call the paranormal today. Okay, important ancestors of this work. William James, obviously, with the varieties of religious experience. And then there's this whole kind of academic lineage that emerges out of that through people like Alistair Hardy and the Religious Experience Research Centre. And this research, William James is like, a pioneer figure, a central figure in the development of psychology, and he was deeply, deeply interested in these subjects. So it's something that is embedded in, yeah, in our academic thinking, really, our scholarly approaches, and it's always been there. So it's not as fringe necessarily as we might think. And when we do look into the kind of mainstream literature on extraordinary experiences, literature that is widely accepted and cited and all of these kind of things, we do find these strands of the deep weird in there. They often get ignored, but they are there. So, yeah, William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience was a pioneering effort to understand extraordinary experiences. And one of the key points that comes out of it, and it's in the title of the book, the varieties, is that there are many, many different kinds of extraordinary or religious experiences, and they can take many different kinds of forms. So I'll just read you this quote from William James. He says, one person might ally this feeling, this religious feeling, to the feeling of dependence. One makes it a derivative from fear. Others connect it with the sexual life. Others still identify it with the feeling of the infinite, and so on. Such different ways of conceiving it ought of themselves to arouse doubt as to whether it possibly can be one specific thing. So he's saying that, religious experience isn't one thing, it's many, many things that come under the same kind of banner or label. And he says, and the moment we're willing to treat the term religious sentiment as a collective name for the many sentiments which religious objects may arouse in alternation, we see that it probably contains nothing whatever of a psychologically specific nature. Okay, so even very early on in the field of extraordinary experience research, there's this acknowledgement of a huge diversity and variety of experiences. So it's not one specific thing, but it is many things. That said, though, William James does identify some sort of connecting strands or connecting principles within this huge diversity. So although there are many experiences, there seem to be similar kinds of processes involved, similar kinds of effects as well. So just some of the major ones that he identified were, you probably encountered these before, the idea of the ineffable, that these experiences can't be adequately put into words, although people try, obviously, and as many words have been spent trying to describe mystical and religious experiences. They're often noetic, so they bring some kind of knowledge or information. In religious experiences, it might be, knowledge of God or of ultimate realities, but we also find a noetic quality in alien abductions and other kinds of paranormal experiences as well, where information is given to the experiencer. These experiences are often transient. There are examples of people who have sort of a lifetime of experiences, or people who are living in maybe in a constant state of bliss or something like that. But for most of the time, these experiences, they come and they go. They're quite short-lived. And just as a sort of added part to that, they're often kind of inconclusive. They're experiences that don't often resolve. Okay, so they're transient. And then this is something that I also like, the idea that they are passive. And what he means by this is that, it feels like the experience is coming from the outside of us. When the experience happens to us, there are rituals and things that people can do to induce extraordinary experiences, obviously, but a lot of the time they come unwilled. They just happen to us. Okay, so there are varieties, but there are also similarities or interconnecting processes, or maybe there are qualities that link these experiences together. Okay, so that's the varieties of religious experience. And there's this kind of lineage in the scholarship of varieties approaches. And I'd like to think of my Deep Weird book as an addition to this lineage. Another varieties approach was in the varieties of psychedelic experiences. And they make similar points here. We can't talk about the psychedelic experience as a single thing. And there are huge variations between people's, psychedelic experiences. They say it's not possible to say that they are typical. Every such experience is in many significant ways very individual. and depends for its structure and content upon what the subject brings to the session in the way of personal history and frame of reference. So there is no one psychedelic experience, and it's influenced by all of these different factors, our cultural background and our psychological makeup and our physiological, organism, the neurochemicals and things that we have in our brains naturally. All of these things affect psychedelic experiences. So there isn't one psychedelic experience. But similar to James, there are these recurring kind of themes or motifs that run throughout them, which make us realize that these experiences are somehow different from normal experiences or everyday experiences. So they describe, for example, changes in the way that the body or the body image is experienced. So our bodies feel different in these states. We have changes in the way that we experience and interact with other people, other persons. We see them a different way, or we engage with them in different ways. And there are also shifts in the way that we experience the non-human world when under the influence of psychedelics. The non-human becomes a bigger kind of aspect of our experience, and we get drawn into it. And they separate the book out into different chapters, different sections that deal with different aspects of psychedelic experiences. Okay, so these again are like broader themes within the diversity. There are these repeating themes. So, psychedelic experiences may include some kind of a voyage inwards, internal kind of experiences. Sometimes they involve aspects of, the psyche, the mind, their symbolic experiences. And they also have within them things that William James might have recognized. In fact, William James was interested in psychedelics himself, but there are themes that are common between psychedelic experiences and religious and mystical experiences. Okay, so but the basic point is there's many different kinds of experiences, but connecting strands. And then in the 21st century, Edsel Cardena and Stanley Krippner, they add to this kind of lineage of thinking about extraordinary experiences with the varieties of anomalous experience. And they're bringing in now into this discourse a whole range of other experiences that have previously been thought of as kind of fringe or, separate, different from religious experiences, for example. So things like synesthesias, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, auditory and visual hallucinations, and then even rarer kinds of experiences, they say, like anomalous healing, past life experiences, near-death experiences, mystical experiences, and alien abductions. You can see then there's this gradual, like, increasing sort of inclusivity in extraordinary experience research and bringing these experiences into the academic discourse. And then in 2023, my Deep Weird book, it's trying to do the same thing, but it's saying that there are even weirder things as well that are not mentioned even in Stanley Krippner's book. And these are things like that we find in ample measure in the Fortean and the kind of more popular paranormal literature. So things like encounters with the Men in Black and the Mothman and all of this kind of stuff, which there are just as powerful kind of narratives about experiences with these things, but they're lumped into a different camp. So what I'm interested in is whether we can draw or build bridges between this kind of accepted academic stuff on religious and extraordinary experiences, and also see where the connections might be with this even stranger stuff. So this is where I'll talk a little bit about the idea of a Boggle threshold, because we've already been introduced to it, which is handy. But everyone has their own Boggle threshold, and everyone's threshold will be dependent on all sorts of different factors, like your academic training or your cultural background, maybe religious beliefs, scientific training. There are all sorts of different things that contribute to our Boggle thresholds. It was coined by Renee Haynes, as we heard, and it's taken to be the point at which any kind of phenomenon or event is deemed to be so outlandish and unlikely that the researcher or whoever it is just going to dismiss it and say that we're not going to go there, basically. Some people will go so far, and then they'll come up against something which they just can't accept. So this is how Renee Haynes defined the term. She said, individual Boggle thresholds will vary with individual temperament, history, training, and aptitude. They will also be influenced by those of the groups to which each individual is linked, family, friends, school, employment, university. In people brought up in the discipline of the physical sciences, the levels of boggledom are likely to differ considerably from the levels found in those brought up in the humanities. But you'll find differences between different humanities disciplines. Mainstream psychology has a very kind of, don't know how you think about it, very low Boggle threshold. Whereas anthropology has maybe a slightly higher Boggle threshold. It can accept more because we have different kinds of frameworks for engaging with it, like relativism and things like that. I don't want to get into that now, but so the basic point is that we all have Boggle thresholds, but these can be limiting in the research that we do. There might be experiences that we come up against that challenge our assumptions or that point us in different directions, or or experiences that have got so many kind of disparate aspects to them that we just don't want to engage with them. So what I want to think about is how we can kind of go beyond the Boggle threshold, step over the Boggle threshold into the world of the deep weird, and start to study it in the same way that we have already, religious experiences and other kinds of paranormal experiences. And this is just one example that I will give to show this kind of Boggle threshold in action. This is from a study of the first 1,000 accounts in the Religious Experience Research Centre. So these were from Alistair Hardy's surveys that he conducted. There's about 6,000 accounts in there now. And Timothy Beardsworth did an analysis of these in the 1970s of the first 1,000 accounts. It's an arbitrary cutoff point, but it gives a nice kind of range of experiences to look at. And he separates the experiences from this first 1,000 accounts into nice, neat categories. So he says the episodes I shall quote involve sensory phenomena, okay, visions, voices, and the like. I classify these phenomena under separate headings according to the sense involved. So got visual experiences, auditory experiences, tactile experiences, inward sensations. And he says there is also the sense of a presence, the feeling that someone is there based on no sensory evidence at all. This feeling, I think, so far as being out on a limb, somehow underlies the other sensory categories. So he thinks that again, there's varieties, but connections between them. But where the Boggle threshold comes in is here. This experience, you can see from the archive reference number that it's experience number 235, came from 1951. It's a female respondent, and it doesn't appear anywhere in Beardsworth's kind of his kind of analysis of the first 1,000 accounts. I'll just read you the experience because, at first glance, you might think this is not a religious experience. So here we go. On the Friday, a man came to clean the carpet and curtains in the drawing room. Later on, there was a complete fusing of everything electrical. Clocks, radios, refrigerators, freezer, TV, all the lights, etc. In the evening, I lay down on a sofa, closed my eyes and tried to relax. I then saw several little green men with very unpleasant expressions. They were looking at me. They seemed to be at a distance. I suppose gnomes or goblins would be an adequate description. I didn't like what I saw, and I was reminded of the time I had a rheumatic illness when I was 7 and had been very alarmed by the little green men I had seen. Hallucinations, presumably. So, this is a sensory experience. It involves, vision, sight, it would fit into these categories that Beardsworth has included in there. But I think likely because of the strangeness of it, the fact that it's electrical equipment that's fusing. This weird guy, this on the Friday, the man comes to clean the carpets, and then these things kind of happen as a consequence of it. This gives me vibes of like the Men in Black, these mysterious figures who turn up in UFO cases, and the weird things that happen when they turn up. And we also have the idea of gnomes and goblins as well, which are always have been as well, kind of on the edge of religion. They're not incorporated into the kind of, the kind of into Christianity, for example. They're on the fringes in the folk kind of culture. So I think, there are a range of things in here that have led to this experience being rejected. But then when we look at it, we see all of these themes that actually are recurrent themes. So there's no real reason to reject it, in my opinion. Okay, so it doesn't appear in Beardsworth's survey of the first 1,000 accounts in the archive, even though it would fit into his category. So I think this is just one example of a Boggle threshold in action. The experience is so bizarre and strange, and it doesn't neatly fit into the category of, a religious or a spiritual experience. And yet at the same time, someone submitted this in response to Alistair Hardy's questionnaire. They must have felt that it had some kind of spiritual significance to them. So yeah, there are these weird experiences then. And these are the kinds of things that I'm becoming increasingly interested in. These, what we might call high strangeness experiences. So again, these constitute what we might call, or what Charles Fort might have called, damned data. Data that is so strange, it doesn't pass the Boggle threshold, and then as a consequence, it gets excluded from the analysis, even though it might have useful things to tell us. Okay, so I will talk a little bit now about Fortean studies in general, because Fortean writers, people like Charles Fort, are kind of on the outside of academia. They're influenced by academia, but they're not constrained in the same way that academics have tended to be. And this means that they've had much more room to explore different kinds of ideas and to discuss the kinds of experiences that are neglected in the academic conversation. Okay, so they haven't necessarily been constrained by the same dominant or paradigmatic kind of structures as academic researchers have. And this means that on the one hand, they're free to explore all sorts of possibilities, but on the other hand, they're probably never going to be accepted into the mainstream. John Keel is another example. He was a journalist, really, but he introduced a whole range of really interesting concepts to try to make sense of these paranormal experiences. Just a couple of examples there, like his ultra-terrestrial hypothesis, which he presented as an alternative, really, to the standard extraterrestrial idea of UFOs, that they come from another planet. And he suggested instead that perhaps they have always been on the Earth, or that they are, in fact, indigenous to the Earth. He also introduced ideas like the super spectrum, this idea that there might be beings that exist on different kind of frequencies, and also the idea of window areas, that some areas might have, like in Celtic tradition, thin places where the veil between the worlds is thin and things come in and out. And he gives lots of examples of places where there are repeated kinds of experiences over and over again. So these are interesting ideas, and John Keel would say, they're not necessarily scientific ideas, but they are based on this data that he's collected, this really strange, anomalous data. So I'm thinking now about whether there can be a kind of a bridge between these kinds of experiences, these kinds of theories, and then the academic approaches of people like, William James, and through that lineage through to the Religious Experience Research Center today. And here are a couple of places where I think that bridges can be made. So one place is with Charles Fort. He came up with this idea even before Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn published a famous book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, in 1962. And he had this idea that science develops um, kind of over time, not in a linear fashion, but you have a build-up of kind of like anomalous data and things, and then it forces a shift of perspective. Um, Charles Fort had a similar idea, but he was writing in sort of the early 1920s. And he called, instead of paradigms, he referred to dominance. He said, in our acceptance, dominance in their succession displace preceding dominance. Okay, so these dominant ways of looking at the world, they come in stages and they replace the older ways of looking at the world as science and things and culture develops. And he says not only because they're more nearly positive, it's not just because they're more accurate, and better able to get new data, but because the old models, the old dominants stop bringing in new data as well. Okay, so he has this idea that we're going to move away from the old dominant of exclusion, so of pushing away these experiences, rejecting them and not discussing them and ignoring them, into a new dominant of being able to talk about them. So he says, our expression is that the new dominant of wider inclusions is now manifesting throughout the world, and that the old exclusionism is everywhere breaking down. So we can look to Charles Fort, as a model for how we might develop a more inclusive kind of approach to these experiences, where we bring things in and don't cut them out. And this means that if we were to apply a kind of Fortean approach to religious studies or paranormal research, then we would want to also include even the most unusual kinds of experiences that would normally exceed our Boggle thresholds. Okay, the Boggle threshold is just a kind of an arbitrary cutoff point for us, and we want to bring in all of these experiences and be able to understand them. So Charles Fort gives us this idea that a new dominant or a new paradigm might be possible. He was writing, over 100 years ago now, and this new dominant is still, hasn't fully manifested. Okay, so the kinds of experiences that Fortean researchers have been interested in are often labeled high strangeness experiences. So I just want to unpack this term a little bit. Mike Cleland is a very interesting author. He writes about UFOs and other kinds of extraordinary experiences. And he says that, the more complex an experience is, he says, the more likely it seems to be kind of real. He describes real life paranormal experiences as like a tangled knot of implausibility. All sorts of different aspects to these experiences. He says synchronicity spills over the edges like an unattended sink. So you get the idea that real life paranormal experiences are kind of confusing and chaotic. But this is not a sign to reject them, he says. It's a sign to trust the event as legitimate. The more complicated the interwoven details, the more valid it seems. And this is something that I've observed myself in collecting extraordinary experiences. I used to think of it as something that was a problem. When I was collecting, like haunted house experiences and things like that years ago, I was like, I just want a nice, neat haunted house experience. But the things that I was actually getting had UFOs and other kinds of things involved in them. And I used to think of that as a reason to reject that experience as too crazy. But now when I see that, I think actually perhaps that's an indication that something actually is going on. The more stuff that's going on, the weirder it is, the more likely it becomes. In Fortean writing, this is called the high strangeness factor. And we get this idea from the work of J. Allen Hynek, who was, he was employed by the US government in the 50s and 60s to investigate the UFO phenomenon. So he's about as mainstream a kind of UFO investigator as you could get, really, and he was an astronomer. And he did a lot of work, kind of explaining away all sorts of different kinds of UFO experiences. If you read the reports that he published, things like Project Blue Book and Project Sign, for the most part, the experiences are kind of explained away. A good example, that he gave was of swamp gas as an explanation, which kind of becomes almost a caricature kind of um, explaining away or debunking of these experiences. But even though he was able to explain away, a huge amount of these experiences, he acknowledged that there was this kernel of experiences that was really baffling and had multiple sort of strange aspects to them. So he says, a light seen in the night sky, the trajectory of which cannot be ascribed to a balloon, aircraft, etc., would nonetheless have a low strangeness rating. So if we just see a light in the sky that's behaving strangely, then it's relatively unstrange. And he says there's only one strange thing to kind of make sense of its weird motion. But then there are other kinds of experiences which are much more enmeshed, I suppose, or entangled with weirdness. So he says, a report of a weird craft that descended within 100 feet of a car on a lonely road caused the car's engine to die, its radio to stop, and its lights to go out, left marks on the nearby ground, and appeared to be under intelligent control, receives a high strangeness rating because it contains a number of separate, very strange items, each of which outrages common sense. Yeah, so that's what we mean by a high strangeness experience. It's something that can't be simply reduced down. George Hansen has also noted this in his book, The Trickster and the Paranormal. I thoroughly recommend for lots of different reasons. And in a kind of an obituary for the psychical researcher D. Scott Rogo, he makes this really interesting point about how interconnected and kind of inseparable all of these different kinds of experiences actually are. He says demonic experiences, Bigfoot sightings, poltergeist action, and phenomena suggesting survival of bodily death have all been reported in conjunction with UFOs. Strange animal mutilations have been reported in poltergeist cases, as well as with UFO sightings. Striking ESP experiences have been reported by UFO contactees. Some of the contactees claim bedroom visitations by angels, extraterrestrial aliens, and mythical creatures. Similar experiences have been reported for thousands of years. These are unsettling claims not only because of their innate strangeness, but also because they fall between the discrete categories most people assume to be valid, and thus most researchers, even those in parapsychology, prefer to ignore them. Okay, so 14 researchers are engaged with these things, but the academics in religious experience research and in parapsychology as well, and even in psychical research, might, their Boggle thresholds might be being activated. So, but the basic point of this is that actually the paranormal really resists neat and easy compartmentalization. And when we do try to compartmentalize these experiences, we're kind of artificially separating them out from their bigger, more complex context. So we want to think about, how can we be as complex really in our understanding as possible. It also might imply some kind of an intelligence that exists behind all of these phenomena. That it's like they actively resist compartmentalization in some way. So that's an idea, for example, that goes way beyond what any kind of normal religious experience researcher would talk about. There are other kinds of weird interconnections between experiences as well. And if you are interested in these kind of fortune topics, I highly recommend Joshua Cutchin's books. They're a real good example of contemporary Fortean kinds of approaches that focus on these weird interconnections. So, for example, his book, The Brimstone Deceit, is all about the role of smells in different kinds of paranormal experiences. And, we can think there are some that are very common, like kind of sulfur kinds of smells, or you think about ghost experiences and the smells of perfume and tobacco and things like that, which are quite commonly reported, or smell of smoke and oil and things like that. There are all of these interesting strands that connect disparate traditions. Like like think about the devil and sulfur and these kind of things, and you find that same sulfur smell in alien encounters or UFO close encounters. And The Trojan Feast is a really interesting book that kind of looks at the role of food in extraordinary experiences, food and drinks. And you find all sorts of examples in ufology of the guy who was given like space pancakes by aliens in his garden, and there are all ideas about leaving food offerings for Bigfoot and fairies as well. So again, we've got this huge kind of variety and diversity of experiences, but when we start to look at them and take them seriously, we find these kind of consistent patterns or themes that emerge, which make us think that maybe there is actually something to these. And although these kind of connections are well attested in the Fortean literature, the academic literature sometimes ignores them. It puts these experiences into phenomenological silos. So we have out-of-body experience researchers who just research out-of-body experiences, and near-death experiences researchers who only research that field. And the same goes for all the other aspects of the paranormal. When actually in people's real kind of experiences, a lot of the time these things are all interconnected and intermingling, feeding into each other. Okay, so this is high strangeness, isn't it? This is what characterizes high strangeness, that it resists being put into these categories, and it breaks them down, or it dissolves binary distinctions and all sorts of things. So just staying with this idea of there being kind of recurring themes and recurring patterns in all of this data, I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about aspects of phenomenology and aspects of the ways that the different researchers have kind of described these experiences. So, although I'm saying that the academic research has often ignored these things, there are snippets of interesting kind of high strangeness in the mainstream literature. And one example of that is with the idea of what William James called superstitious dread, this feeling of superstitious dread, which is a real recurrent theme, especially in the paranormal. Many paranormal experiences are frightening experiences and are not even pleasant experiences. And William James, although he devotes most of his time to writing about the positive impacts of religious and mystical experiences on people, there is also this kind of darker, kind of more frightening aspect. And he gives an interesting example, an illustration of this from a respondent. Quite early in the night, I was awakened. I felt as if I'd been aroused intentionally, and at first thought someone was breaking into the house. I then turned on my side to go to sleep again, and immediately felt a consciousness of a presence in the room, and singular to state, it was not the presence of a live person, but of a spiritual presence. I felt also at the same time a strong feeling of superstitious dread, as if something strange and fearful were about to happen. So, this is not a pleasant kind of experience, and William James was aware of that. Rudolf Otto was also aware of this. He was a German theologian, and he had done a lot of traveling, so he had seen that Buddhists were reporting these kind of religious experiences that were very similar to the kinds of experiences that Christians were reporting, in other far off places. So he started to see these connections, that people were having these experiences and maybe interpreting them through different cultural lenses. And to kind of get at this pre-cultural experience, this thing that people were having direct contact in, he coined this term, the numinous. It actually comes from Immanuel Kant and his idea about the noumenal world being this world that is just beyond our perception, that we can never actually grasp. But sometimes Otto's saying this experience does come, and we do see or have access to this other world. And he identified these two kind of strands within the numinous. There is the mysterium tremendum on the one hand, which is the kind of, like we were just saying, this feeling of superstitious dread or fear. Sometimes he talked about the mysterium horrendum. So there was this horrific aspect of many religious experiences. And then parallel to that, and often actually these two experiences, or he called them feeling responses, are kind of simultaneous. So you have at the same time the feeling of awe and wonder, and the experience is so strange and intriguing that you can't help but look and be drawn into it, at the same time as feeling this sense of dread and doom. Um, he suggested that this feeling response of the numinous is conjured through our interactions with what he called the wholly other. Okay, so these things which he said have no place in our scheme of reality, but which belong to an absolutely different one. We could argue against that and say, I think actually many of these experiences are natural. But there are certain things or certain entities or objects or whatever it is, places even, where when we interact with them through our physical bodies, it induces these feeling responses within us. And again, he highlights the kind of diversity of this feeling response. He says the feeling of it may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship. It may burst in sudden eruption up from the depths of the soul with spasms and convulsions, or lead to the strangest excitements, to intoxicated frenzy, to transport and to ecstasy. It has its wild and demonic forms, and can sink to an almost grisly horror and shuddering. It may become the hushed trembling and speechless humility of the creature in the presence of that which is a mystery inexpressible, which is great. The numinous then arises, when we interact with certain places or things or entities. And he even kind of developed a kind of a theory of religion from this, that, we have these experiences, we kind of label them, we give them names, and he says that haunted houses really are kind of the origin of religion, or haunted places. When a person goes into a place and they say, it's not quite right here, it's uncanny, this place is haunted. Here we have the obscure basis of meaning and idea rising into greater clarity and beginning to make itself explicit as the notion of a transcendent something, a real operative entity of a numinous kind, which later assumes concrete form as a numen loci, a daemon, an el. So he's basically saying that, we have these experiences and then we name them, and then traditions build up around them. Okay, but the main point is that he identified this numinous as a kind of both frightening and beautiful at the same time. The weird is another term that people might use to describe their experiences. This is from Mark Fisher, who was a literary theorist. He said that the weird is a particular kind of perturbation. It involves a sensation of wrongness. A weird entity or object is so strange that it makes us feel that it should not exist, or at least it should not exist here. Yet if the entity or object is here, then the categories which we have up until now used to make sense of the world cannot be valid. So weird things dissolve these boundaries, and that's part of what makes them weird. H.P. Lovecraft, who was, he's a controversial writer, he wrote an essay about weird fiction, which he was a kind of a proponent of. And he makes a similar point about weirdness. He says, the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains, according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint expressed with the seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguards against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So it's a really lovely kind of gothic description, but he's really saying the same thing as Rudolf Otto was saying about the numinous. He's describing the same superstitious dread that William James identified, and that's what he was trying to elicit with his writing. I'll just talk a little bit about the idea of the surreal as well, because people who have these experiences, they might say, I had a really surreal experience today, and we want to think about what they actually mean by that. When Andre Breton coined the term surreal, he was referring to psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought. When we think about, when someone says they had a surreal experience, then perhaps their experience was, you know, a kind of an experience of this pure functioning of mind, dictated by thought in the absence of any control exercised by reason. So, surreal is bizarre, it's irrational, and exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. And this is what we also see in these paranormal experiences. That they shock us, and we are exposed to frightening events that, we that have nothing to do with what we want or expect. Um, Saran Alexandrian, who was a historian of surrealism, said that the aim of the surrealists was to reconcile reality with the illogical processes which arise in ecstatic states or in dreams, with the aim of creating a super reality. Surrealism cannot accurately be described as fantasy, but as a superior reality in which all the contradictions which afflict humanity are resolved as in a dream. And so, there is a reason why people describe their experiences as surreal. And it could be, that these experiences, they're where these bound binaries break down and all those kinds of things. They exceed our aesthetic expectations. So, truly surreal experiences would be ones where boundaries between inner and outer worlds dissolve, between subjective and objective, these dissolve dream and reality. And just one more sort of phenomenological kind of descriptor or characteristic is the idea of the Oz factor. This comes from the work of the UFO researcher Jenny Randles, and it's something that she recognized in across a whole spectrum of different kinds of UFO cases, and you also find it in other kinds of extraordinary experiences as well. She says this is a set of symptoms which create the impression of temporarily having left our material world and entered another dreamlike place with magical rules. It tells us most notably that the percipient has changed their state of consciousness. The result is a dreamy and weirdly silent state of mind that is recognized as peculiar, even though they do not appreciate what it implies. And this Oz factor could be a kind of a trigger for these experiences. So perhaps you have to be in a certain state of consciousness to have the experience, or in which case it's a kind of precondition of the experience, or it could be a consequence of the experience, or maybe it's both. Maybe you do have to be in a kind of an Oz state to have an experience, but there are things that also induce that experience in us. So I'll just give a couple of examples. This is an experience that was sent to me by someone who was trying to make sense of this paranormal experience that they'd had with a friend while they were walking out in the back garden near his friend's house. And this is from North America. It says, and I've highlighted these themes now that are emerging. Although this is a very strange experience, it fits into these themes. Both of us immediately saw something out of place, okay, which is what Rudolf Otto talked about. Below, about 30 to 40 feet away from us, in between the trees, there was something tall, white, three-dimensional. It appeared to be completely white and soft like light, but it did not illuminate the trees or ground around it. I haven't talked about it, but there are all sorts of things about light experiences in the paranormal. It was shaped in an upside-down V or U. It was so white that you could see the shadow being cast on it while it was swaying like it was a real animal. It was making creepy swaying movements with its whole body. It was moving left to right in a specific motion, standing on the forest floor in the same area between the trees, making absolutely no sound, and there was absolutely no wind. So it's the Oz factor. It was beautiful to look at, but terrifying at the same time. There's almost a word for word Rudolf Otto quote. We watched it in silence as it was swaying, and I started to feel impending doom. The sinking feeling in your chest set in, and it felt like I was going to die or something bad was going to happen. I told my friend specifically, I don't like this. He agreed, and we immediately left the forest. So, this is a super weird experience with a kind of anomalous being that has no kind of similarities with any kind of animal that we would recognize, although it appears to move like an animal. And then it has all of these kind of phenomenological hallmarks of other kinds of extraordinary experiences bound into it. So this feeling of the numinous, the impending dread, or superstitious dread, like William James would call it. So, although it's a very strange experience, And it would be considered, this would be a Fortean kind of experience. It nevertheless resonates with things that, the mainstream academic research on religious experience have identified. And this is just another little short experience that was given to me by one of my students when I was teaching. He said, I was around 7 years old when my cousin was staying over for the night. My bed was positioned to the right of the window in my bedroom, and the curtains were drawn. My cousin was reading. A strange, deep-toned voice with a kind of distorted resonance sounded from the window, capturing both our attention. I've highlighted this because there is a kind of a recurrent theme across a range of experiences of them being sort of initiated by a loud sound or a buzzing noise or some kind of there's an interesting experience with a siren sound that initiates it. My cousin told me not to go. I was too curious and slowly walked towards the window before opening the curtains. In the center of the window was a face of light. The bright light seemed to be pulsating inside of the face. The mouth began moving and the deep, vibrating, muffled voice started to speak. I was unable to understand most of it and was too in shock to pay close enough attention. I felt locked in place during the event and was in disbelief of what was happening. My cousin jumped off the bed and we both ran downstairs. When we approached the window again, it had completely gone. So again, it's a transient experience. They went downstairs to get their parents, and when they came back up, it was completely gone. It's a really weird experience, a high strangeness experience for sure, but it also has these themes that run through it. So these are just some of the kind of themes that run through high strangeness experiences. They are complex experiences with many components. There's often a kind of an encounter with some kind of non-human entity or something that is alien or wholly other. And this is a theme that I'm really interested in, but I'm not going to go into now of communication being attempted. And often the communication is miscommunication. There are things like the unusual behavior of lights that move or lights that shine differently to normal lights, sense of the numinous with wonder, the mysterium fascinans, which gives way to the dread, the mysterium tremendum and horrendum, the Oz factor, this weird silent state of mind, and a sense of the uncanny, the surreal, the absurd, dream logic, and those kind of things, and also this lack of resolution. So, how are we going to deal with this stuff then? Charles Fort gives us a useful kind of philosophical framework, which he calls intermediatism. He defines it really, it's kind of like a spectrum way of thinking about what is real and what isn't real. And he says that according to his philosophy, nothing is real, but nothing is unreal. All phenomena are approximations in one way between realness and unrealness. So even something that is unreal and doesn't exist is somewhere along this spectrum. So it's not discrete, it's continuous, and it ranges from things that are very concrete and real right through to things that are very subtle, I suppose would be a way of thinking about it. This is how Jeffrey Kripal frames it. He says, with this term, Fort meant to refer to a philosophical position that involves the refusal of all easily polarizing answers to the problems of the paranormal, and the related insistence that whatever such phenomena are or are not, they cannot be mapped onto the cognitive grids of the pair's mental material, real, unreal, subjective, objective, and so on. So they don't fit into those categories. Fort encourages us to take a holistic perspective on these things. And this quote I love. He says, we shall pick up an existence by its frogs. If there is an underlying oneness of all things, it doesn't matter where we begin, whether with stars or laws of supply and demand or frogs or Napoleon Bonaparte. One measures a circle beginning anywhere. And this comes back to what I mean by the deep weird. These experiences are very strange and bizarre, and they're not for everyone, which is fair enough. But if we do investigate them, then they can tell us something about the world. They can tell us something useful. And it gives us this a kind of broader appreciation of both diversity and unity, that there are all these different things that we could focus on and investigate, but there are also things that connect them together. And just one more concept that he uses is transmediumization. Again, it's pointing in this direction of boundary dissolving. He refers to transmediumization, this concept, as meaning the passage of phenomena from one medium of existence into another. So like we were talking about this sliding spectrum, things might move along it. And he says, I mean the imposition of the imaginary upon the physical. I mean not the action of mind upon matter, but the action of mind matter upon matter mind. And what I think is useful about this is he's pointing us in the direction of theories and ideas that are, becoming prevalent now. Things like panpsychisms, where, mind and matter are interconnected, animisms, and also new materialism, these new ideas, which I don't have time to go into. So just to finish off, my framework for thinking about this and for giving me a kind of, a philosophical, it's more of a sort of a mentality or a mode of thinking about things than any kind of method or technique. I call it ontological flooding. And I take the idea really from, in phenomenology, this idea of bracketing. In phenomenology, they talk about bracketing out questions of ontology. You just focus on the experience and you don't ask whether it's real or not. And I always found that very problematic because we want to talk about whether these experiences are real or not. So my idea is, instead of putting up brackets to hold back all these possible ideas, we let down those brackets completely and entertain a whole ocean of different ideas and not really putting any one on a pedestal. This is how I described it, 10 years ago now. Rather than bracketing out questions of ontology for fear that they might lead to truths. So these with things like damned facts that can't fit into the established order of Western academia's dominant ontology. I suggest that we essentially open the floodgates of ontological possibilities. This places all ontologies, all sort of models of reality, all ideas about these phenomena on an equal footing, so that while ontological bracketing protects and reinforces the mainstream consensus reality, what we might call ontological flooding destabilizes it and opens it up to questioning, exploration, and expansion. It brings in all of these different possible ideas. And it's not a solution to the problem, obviously, but it's a mindset that we can try to encourage in ourselves to take seriously many possibilities simultaneously and try to avoid reducing ourselves down to any one in particular. Okay. This doesn't mean that we should be any less.
Sorry, Jack. How many more slides have you got? Because it's
Not
already
many. This is the
already
end now.
9:10.
I've got this, my conclusions.
Yes, maybe you could just go on to your conclusions rather than reading that slide.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
these are the conclusions then. We all have Boggle thresholds. We want to get beyond them. Charles Fort gives us a useful kind of framework for approaching this. If we could bring high strangeness phenomenology into conversation with the mainstream kind of religious experience research, then that would be very useful. If we focus on the phenomenology, then we can build these bridges between Fortian researchers and the mainstream academic research. And Fort's philosophical ideas about intermediatism, transmediumization, and all of these kind of things, although they're not academic ideas, they open us up to different kinds of ontological possibilities. And ontological flooding as a mindset for approaching research means that we can bring them in and put them into dialogue with William James and with Alistair Hardy and all of that kind of stuff. So there we go. Some references.
Thanks so much, Jack. That was an incredible tour de force in terms of looking at a variety of perspectives and ways of thinking. And I was really struck by Charles Fort and how his ideas of intermediatism and the taken up in a way by Jeff Kripal, provide a much more nuanced way of thinking about these things. And I'd potentially be interested in an article, particularly from about Charles Fort's approach to this, because I think there's a lot of people, they've heard of him, but they don't probably take him very seriously. Probably not for very good reasons.